Please welcome Sarah Kunst, Managing Director of Cleo Capital, Dalila Wilson-Scott, Comcast Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, and Ali Velshi, MSNBC anchor.
Joining me for this great conversation are Dalila Wilson-Scott. She's the president of the Comcast Foundation, someone with whom I've had a great chance to have conversations about major change and how it starts in the past. And Sarah Kunst, who is the managing director of Cleo Capital and a contributing editor at Marie Claire. Thanks to both of you for joining me, because we have a short amount of time in which we've got to address the biggest of problems. But the good news is that both of you have been involved in ways in which these problems get addressed. So if we want to talk about real diversity in the workplace, we have to talk about diversity in leadership. We have to talk about women in the C-suite. But it's kind of like smoking, right? It doesn't just end because you do one thing. It's that there's an entire ecosystem that causes kids to smell smoke and say that's wrong, and restaurants to not have you smoke in them, and people not wanting you smoking in their rental cars. So the idea here is it's not a prohibition. It's the opposite. It's how do we create the environment for women to be in all the positions necessary to guarantee leadership. And that means women as investors, women as startups that can be financed, women in training positions and executive positions, women in board positions. All of this has to happen before we get some sort of equity in that. So, Sarah, I'm going to start with you because you do work in the world in which we bring women into places that can be remarkably successful.
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me. I run Cleo Capital. We're an early stage venture capital firm. And, we don't just invest in women, but it turns out that when you focus really hard on reducing bias and making it very clear that all are welcome, you end up investing in a lot of everybody. So in our portfolio, 90% of our portfolio have founders who are women, who are people of color, who are LGBTQ, who are immigrants, who are even just based outside of, New York, LA, San Francisco. And so that kind of diversity comes when you look at the world and say, when you look at the world of funding and 96% of investors are men, over 90% of all funding goes to men, predominantly to white men. You either look at that and say, white men are the only smart people in the world, or there's something wrong with our system. And I'm here to tell you there's something wrong with our system.
I think that's well put, that if you look for diversity generally, you achieve diversity because it's just the effort of looking for it. Part of the problem, the statistics you just cited, Dalila, you'll understand because you operate at the boardroom level. And that's where some of that diversity of thought is missing. Sometimes diversity of thought comes from having diversity of people around the table. Sometimes there are other ways to do it. But really, unless you have this coming from both ends, from the bottom end where you're helping women with startups or get into corporations where they can climb that ladder, to the top end where you're making better decisions about where you put your money, you have to solve it on both ends.
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely critical we have representation at the board level, at the C-suite. But when we think about success, we really need to build that culture and environment for people to be successful. We can all think of diverse individuals who have held C-suite positions. And quite frankly, ultimately, it didn't end up working out well for them or for the company because there wasn't the commitment there or the environment for that person to be successful. So I think that's very important. The other thing is the larger you are as a company, the more decisions that are made every day where race can come into play, gender. And so you have to be thoughtful about every level of the company and making sure that it's not a topic that people just talk about when it's convenient. I think what's interesting about this year, and one of the silver linings, as difficult as it may be, race is definitely being discussed more in the workplace than ever before. People talked about diversity, people talked through some of the work they were doing from a philanthropic standpoint, but I think this is a very different and more targeted conversation that people are having this year about race, about equity, about wealth and communities of color. And I think that's where the entrepreneurial piece comes in as well. We have to be committed to go above and beyond.
So this is interesting. You're right. I think it is much more targeted than it has been before. You talk about commitment to doing this and creating the right environment. But Sarah, there still remains pushback, right? Part of the reason why so many women founded and women run companies have difficulty with finding the funding that they need on an ongoing basis at early stage or stage C or public is that there are still built-in prejudices. Women at a table asking for funding get asked different questions than men do. So men can come up with some crazy risky idea about, I'm going to make a phone that has ears, like big floppy ears, and everybody's going to love it. And somebody's going to say, it's great. Here's $1 billion for it. If a woman comes to the table with that, they're going to say, are you sure this ears thing is going to work? Like, what makes you think that? Why would anybody buy that? Women get asked different questions. They are seen as having a different risk profile than men are.
Absolutely. There's an amazing study from Harvard Business School that when a woman and a man sort of pitch the exact same business plan, right? And they've tried this along racial lines, and all the results are exactly what you would think. And it's really disheartening to see that it is not necessarily the quality of the idea. It's our internal biases around who is pitching us that idea. I think for a long time there was a thought of, you can't be what you can't see. But now, as somebody that you can see, I can tell you that doesn't immediately, that certainly might be helpful to younger generations coming up, which is incredibly meaningful to me, but it doesn't immediately change the person you're across the table from. For a long time, there weren't as many female founders, there weren't as many Black and Hispanic founders. And then in the past kind of 5 years, we've seen a lot more, but they don't get more funding. Because if there's not, in one of the biggest correlations to having diverse, to funding diverse populations is having a diverse investment team. We see this with gender, we see this with race, and that's certainly not to say that if you're a white man, you're not responsible for funding, people of color, women, but there is that correlation. There's even a huge correlation. Harvard Business School has a great case on this around the fact that male investors with daughters tend to invest in a lot more women.
So it's that obvious. It's your exposure to ideas. How do you deal with, Dalila? One of the issues that comes up is this idea that people are more comfortable, as Sarah said, with what they know and whom they know. So you've got these guys who come out of business schools and they do these startups, and it's almost like, and I've heard the bragging that I'm going to have this startup in 2 years and it's almost fully funded, but there's actually not an idea on the table. There's not even a thing that's happening. How do we, what does the line look like between funding more diverse ventures is the right thing to do versus this is white space where there's remarkable opportunity, where there isn't the same competition for funding, where we can get in there, not just change the world like we should, but these are actually, Sarah's examples are good companies that actually have great returns.
Absolutely. I mean, I think whether it's a VC, a hiring decision, people are definitely challenged with looking beyond their network. And they often are not critiqued on that. They're often not getting any pushback from the environment they exist in. I think, the more points we can put on the board and make those points visible, this won't be viewed as as a side project, something that's nice to do. We recently invested in the Center for Black Innovation. So Felicia Hatcher out of Miami, Code Fever, she merged with Black Tech Mecca, and she's focused on sort of building this entrepreneurial ecosystem across the country in a number of different cities. I think what's interesting about her model is she's also building a training boot camp to help bring more Black angel investors into the fold. So individuals who have been fortunate enough to build wealth, but haven't been taught the rules of the road as it relates to VC, because we know if people of color, if women are in those seats, and Sarah talks about this, in a lot of her discussions on thinking about scouts and who we need in those scout roles, for sure, we know that there'll be more diverse examples that will be brought to fruition.
So this idea of a training boot camp for angel investors and VCs, Sarah, would be helpful to allow people to say, hey, look, we'll vet the investment the same way we'd vet it for anybody else. But this will be different. This will offer you a different return. This will get you some skin in the game. And this can offer you some of the big returns that the boys have been playing with for a long time.
Yeah, I think that there's a cultural sort of idea around risk and reward and what we get rewarded by. I remember when I was, in my 20s, living in New York City, I'd go on dates with guys and they'd be like, I'm an angel investor. And I worked in investing. And so I was like, oh, what have you invested in? half the time it would be like one thing they put $1,000 into. Meanwhile, I'll talk to women who write 100,000, $250,000 of angel checks a year, and they don't brag about themselves as an angel investor. And I think some of it is the perception of how we think about, Sally Krawcheck at Ellevest, former CEO of Merrill Lynch, is a mentor of mine. And a thing we talk about a lot is like nothing bad happens when you give women money, right? But a lot of times I think women don't know that. And so, I teach, Felicia Hatcher in Miami is amazing. I've done work with her, and I teach sometimes a workshop for women wherever I am called, Angel Investing 101. And one of the things I say, and I mean this with not at all facetiously, is, if you can afford a Birkin, you can afford to angel invest, right? And as somebody who used to work at Chanel, like I really like Birkins. I hear you on this, right? But the reality is that there are a lot of women, there are a lot of people of color who are, high net worth, who can afford the Birkin, but they've never looked in the mirror and thought I should angel invest. And I sort of think of it akin to women running for office, right?
Right.
You have to ask a woman in general 3 times to run. Meanwhile, you could be a failed pretend billionaire with a gold toilet and decide to ruin the country. So, but thankfully Philly saved it. So shout out Philly. But it's one of those things where there's this disconnect. And even when people have money, I know some of the richest women in the world, the absolute richest name brand billionaires in the world, who still have men making the final decisions about their money. Men that they pay, not even men that they're married to or men that they inherited money with. And it's just sort of disheartening. And so anything we can do, I make it a practice. Anytime I see a Birkin on a woman, I look her in the eyes and I say, "Oh, are you angel investing?" And
that's a brilliant approach.
Starts doing it.
That's a brilliant approach. Dalila, let's talk a little bit about culture all around, because this is an ideas we can steal. So I think the end result is, what if Philly became a center for a place with the best knowledge and understanding of women-owned, minority-owned firms as startups and as an investing center? What does the cultural shift look like? We've talked about a bunch of the little things, and they're not that little, but the things that can change to allow women to get the funding they need, the training they need as Birkin to angel investors. What's the cultural shift? Because you work in a major corporation. What's the cultural shift we need, the kind that stopped us from smoking, to get us to believe in, invest in, and invest alongside women and minorities?
And, I definitely want to take a moment to talk to smaller businesses. We have entrepreneurs around the country right now, small businesses that are struggling. And Black-owned businesses are definitely struggling, depending on what stats you look at, 3 to 10 times more than other businesses, quite frankly. Just recently, we launched a program called Comcast Rise. And this was born out of the commitment we made early in June. Our CEO, Brian Roberts, decided we were going to commit $100 million to advance social justice and equity. And that meant we had to think about, what do we do well as a company, and what were we willing to do differently in this moment, to be transformative and really think about race. So what Comcast Rise does is allow small businesses, Black-owned, BIPOC-owned businesses, to get access to media resources, commercial ad time, even creating their own commercials to run on local networks around the country, as well as cash grants. And I think, in this moment, especially with COVID, with so many businesses struggling, I don't want to forget to think about the small businesses. All of us know a small business that has struggled over the past few months. And those are entrepreneurs. They're creating jobs, they're creating wealth in communities, and they're strong members of the community, and they're everywhere across the country. And I think that really, sort of makes the point that, talent is everywhere, but you have to be willing to look for it. And again, make the investment. And make that bet. And to the point that we were just talking about, we have to think about risk differently. So I think Philly can absolutely be an incredible tech talent pipeline with the right investment and with the right focus.
Right, and we've already got the tech pipeline start. We've got that idea in Philadelphia. We've got the universities. We've got the startup companies. We got that kind of support. So it's just a bit of a mind shift. I have to ask you, Sarah. You talked about politics, women running for politics, and it made me think: to what degree is this info structure and influenced by women in politics or political decisions around women. So a few years ago, we saw in France and Norway legislation about having women on boards, which in theory would lead to more women in the C-suite, which in theory would lead to better practices in companies for women. In Canada, when Justin Trudeau first became prime minister, his cabinet was 50% women. And when asked why, he said, because it's 2015. That's the way it goes. We're now seeing with the Biden transition team a large number of women and minorities forming, the highest levels of the government. We are going to have a Black woman as the vice president of the United States. Talk to me about the cultural and political stuff that supports the idea that this isn't charity and this isn't something you do to feel good, that this is actually the way economics works.
Diversity drives better returns and diversity drives better outcomes. And so if you believe that, then anytime you're doing something of incredible importance, a big question is this team set up for success? Right? If you are doing heart surgery, you want to know, is this a good cardiologist, right? We want to know that we're going to set ourselves up for success. And so, to Justin Trudeau's point, the reason to have a diverse group of people around the table is it's 2015. And I take that one step further, and we want the best results possible. In terms of legislation helping drive some of these changes, California now has a similar women on boards mandate, right? What ends up happening there is a bit of a question mark. It might end up being that a lot of the initial women who are slated are women who are slated with the understanding of they're just going to fall in line, they're going to agree, but that still makes a huge difference. The biggest indicator that you will be on a corporate board, and just to be clear, corporate boards often pay upwards of $1 million a year for 12 days of work a year. I don't know about you guys, but I have to work at least 13 days to make $1 million, is that if you're already on a corporate board. So to some extent, right, I don't often see white men looking themselves in the mirror saying, oh no, did I get here because there's bias towards me, or did I get here because I earned it? Right. And so when you look at that, why not? Let's have more diversity on boards and let's have the government legislate it. We've had, capitalism has been around for quite a while in this country, right? And we still haven't done this organically. Right. And it reminds me a little bit of being young. And when you're supposed to clean your room, that's what you do all Saturday. It's Saturday evening. Your mom comes in your room and it's not clean. And she says, well, I gave you the chance to do it yourself. If you can't do it yourself, there's going to be a little bit of oversight here. And I think that is fair. America's had roughly 400 years, right, to walk back our original sins of genocide and slavery and, to give everyone the right to vote, to treat everyone equally, to allow everyone to, have equal marriage. We haven't done it. So, if the government has to come in and say, America, you're grounded until you get this together, so be it. We deserve the punishment.
This could be, the government hasn't done it to the extent, Dalila, that in many, many cases, when it comes to equity, and we're talking about something today that's well beyond equity. We're talking about investing in and growing and promoting women and people of color. But when it comes to the government's role, sometimes major corporations are further ahead because they can figure out that I need this in order to recruit properly, in order to represent my audience properly, in order to demonstrate that we've got corporate social responsibility. Sometimes companies lead on these things as opposed to government.
There's definitely just growing interest, in a company, to your point, of attracting talent, having a corporate reputation that employees want to be a part of. People ask those questions now, right? Even just responding to social media. Companies have to be much more transparent about what they're doing and much more aggressive about what they're doing in this day and age. But we're talking about systemic racism here. So something that took 400 years to bring us to this point is not going to solve itself immediately. That said, we're proud to be a company that has, over 50% women and people of color on our board, but we're not resting there. We know that as a company, we have to constantly evaluate our policies, our practices. Implicit bias is real, and we have to be willing to challenge that. And I do think some of that conversation gets easier the more and more people talk about race, the more and more people think about the tactics that work. What does allyship, what does sponsorship look like in the workplace? And what does it look like when it's well managed and tracked? It's one thing to have a goal out there and targets. It's another thing to be running and measuring and managing diversity like you would every other business metric, because that's really the focus we have to put on it if we want to move the numbers.
So I think this concept of allyship is really interesting. Sarah, when we talk about investments, women founding businesses, startups, things like that, what does allyship look like?
Yeah, I think it looks like a lot of things. One, if you have a lot of money and you are not following your allyship in whatever form with capital, you either don't understand the problem or you don't really care about the solution, right? Venture capital means that the best way to help people is with capital. I was sitting across from a very well-known female billionaire once, and she was saying, do you need more sponsorship? Do you need more mentorship? Do you need more education? I was like, I need money, I need money, I need money. We need money. That's how it works. Like, how do you buy your private plane? With money, right? And so definitely, I think sometimes there's such a urge to sort of go build all these other systems, right? That we ignore the lever that got us here in the first place, which is groups having a lot of capital. So do not sleep on that. Give people money, right? Specifically, give women and people of color money. And so, but on top of that, in terms of allyship, it's everything, right? So if you went back and did an audit of through your career, of the gender and race of all of the experts you talk to, right? Not like whoever happens to be the CEO of the company that's in the headlines, you have to talk to that person, but the voices around the table, right? What does that look like, right? And you seem like an incredibly progressive person. I would be shocked if it were 50% women and 13% Black and 13%, like it's probably not going to match population parity, right? And that's like a really easy thing that we can all think about and we can all do. I buy my toilet paper and paper towels from a company called Reel, REEL, that is a Black-owned bamboo sustainable toilet paper. It's COVID. We're all eating toilet paper every other week. Think about how you can make small sustainable changes, right? That are not costing you anything extra. Think about how you can spend your extra money, right? Think about where your investment dollars go. Even, if you work with Morgan Stanley, call them up and say, hey, I want to move some of my money that you managed for me under a Black wealth manager. Just ask them, a woman wealth manager, right? White men, and specifically white men, control over 95% of all the capital in the world in terms of ultimate money managers. When you think about the entire world, that stat is wildly, out of whack, right? So what can you do to help make those changes? And then, yes, it is the mentorship. It is who, you're leaning into. It is when you go to hire somebody, you just get a good feeling about somebody, stop and take a look back and say, did they look exactly like I did at that age? Because if so, you're probably hiring them more for that sort of sense of familiarity than for their raw talent, right? In the NFL, they have the Rooney Rule where they have to interview a Black senior executive for every senior job. It doesn't totally fix things. There's another Harvard business study that says if you only have one woman in your employee pool, there's statistically, in your applicant pool, there's statistically zero chance she'll be picked. And if you double that to just 2 women, it doesn't matter the size of the pool, the odds that a woman will be picked skyrocket, right? So educate yourself on how bias works and look yourself in the mirror and say, I don't think I have a speck of hate in my heart, and I am definitely still biased against people every single day. And that's true of me, that's true of you, that's true of everyone. That's just how humans are. So what do? We go out and we, on purpose, we very intentionally work to reduce that bias. And I think a lot of it is just, what gets measured gets managed. And so you have to measure it in your own life. I think
that is such tremendous, specific advice that individuals can take. Thank you for that, Sarah. Sarah, what do you say to people who say that I make my investment decisions based purely on performance and returns?
Well, I have excellent news from them. Diversity drives returns. And so if they're not investing in a diverse set of managers and a diverse set of strategies, if they're doing direct investments, they are leaving money on the table. So there are a lot of social reasons to not be racist, to not be sexist. However, my favorite reason, because I'm a venture capitalist, is because it drives returns, right? It is literally my job. My job is not to help companies. My job is not to invest in companies. My job is to take the money that someone gives me and hand them back $3 to $5 for every dollar they hand me, right? So I am looking for, how do I do that, right? Where do I find that money? And the reality is that investing in diverse teams drives better returns. And so when I know that when I invest in diverse teams, I get to do my job better. Right. And so every filthy rich person in the world would be 20 to 30% filthier richer if they were investing in diverse teams. And you know that Elon Musk needs that extra $20 billion.
Dalila, one of the things that continues to occur, it sort of, this has always fascinated me, that I would have thought with startups out of Silicon Valley, with the smartest people in the world who are numbers driven either through returns or through engineering, we would see a lower instance of the sort of prejudice that we've seen against people of color or women. But in fact, it's higher. It's statistically even worse with startups and with young companies, particularly in the tech sector, largely for the same reasons, the exposure. We're getting the same group of people who are building these companies. They're running in the same circles. They're graduating from the same colleges. They're raising money for each other. At some point, you said something that really interested me. The reason a company, particularly a large company, particularly a company like Comcast, will ultimately need to do the right thing is because once we get past this pandemic, our unemployment number will be really low again. And you will be competing for every woman and every person of color at every level of your company, including the most senior level. So unless you have some sort of infrastructure that says, we're good for you and you're good for us, people will just make other choices.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I also think that there is this overweight belief that the smartest people are in Silicon Valley, which further supports the belief that the smartest people tend to be young white males in hoodies, and it's just not true. There's smart people everywhere. So one, there just has to be that acknowledgement. I mean, even it's interesting around diversity because even with data that shows diversity drives performance, people still choose not to believe it. So I do think that we have to set new cultural norms. We have to make sure that, VC investment, C-suite positions are available well beyond San Francisco, and that Silicon Valley isn't the only place that type of innovation can happen. In fact, it's more likely to happen outside of the traditional hotspots, I would say. But I think we have to get people to understand that. And so, but yes, competing for talent, it's definitely, people have talked about the war on talent for forever. I also think that COVID has accelerated a lot of trends, especially as it relates to tech talent for sure. All of us are thinking about AI and what type of bias is there that we need to be cognizant of, but also investing in employees and reskilling employees. There was a time where people would get their education, be trained for a certain career, and that was the career you would live out your life. That's not true anymore. Companies have to be willing to invest consistently and repeatedly in their employees to attract new players, but also just to keep up with demands and technology and innovation. So it's no longer kind of a one-shot done. We're in an environment where everybody requires continuous education, and employers are going to have to bear a lot of the expense to do that if they want to retain top talent.
This has been a fantastic conversation with both of you. No surprise, Dalila, because you and I have talked before, and I know where it comes from you. But Sarah, you've given me stuff to write down and talk to people about and actually do in my life. And both of you have given us such good guidance about how anybody listening to this can help make Philly a center for this. These ideas you have provided to us are ideas we should steal and we should implement, and they're easy to do. You're not waiting for some cure for something. These are things that can happen now through conversations with the people around you, with the investors around you, with your bankers, with people who know about companies that are founded or started by women who need investment. And I think I can speak for both of you in saying there are lots out there. So if you have money to invest, there is a lot of opportunity for you out there to find new, interesting, and diverse ways to invest your money, and that's actually going to be good for your portfolio. Thanks to both of you for your time today. Dalila Wilson-Scott is the president of the Comcast Foundation. Sarah Kunst is the managing editor of Cleo Capital. Thanks to both of you for being here for Ideas We Can Steal.
A special thank you to our sponsors.